Hi listeners, Jason here. We are excited to finally announce registrations for the biggest psych health and safety community event ever. The inaugural The Psych Health and Safety Conference will be held at the Sofitel Wentworth, Sydney, June 19 to 20, 2024 and offer concurrent virtual attendance. It'll feature live podcast recordings with OG researchers including Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter of Burnout fame, Psych Health and Safety USA podcast host I. David Daniels, Australian super experts including the likes of David Burrows, a special 10-year anniversary integrated approaches to workplace mental health panel with authors Tony Lamontagna, Angela Martin and Kat Page, hand-picked case studies from organisations doing it well, and a very special interview with plaintiff Zagi Kozarov by Catherine Dunlop on that High Court case which we previously covered on the podcast. This event will sell out. Get in quick to secure tickets at early bird prices for the 2-day conference, pre-conference masterclasses, and the VIP dinner. The first 200 in-person registrations also get a copy of her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, signed by Christina Maslach herself. Find out more and register at www.psychhealthandsafetyconference.com. Now, on to this episode.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hello and welcome to the UK Psych Health and Safety Podcast. I'm Peter Kelly, I'm your host for today. And today I've got a friend from LinkedIn, someone who we've engaged a lot, and I really wanted to give the listeners the opportunity to hear from Steve Phillip. How are you?
Hello, Peter. Yes, really good. Thank you. Happy New Year to you. Depending on when this broadcast goes out, of course, you can.
It'll be in the new year.
Yeah. but yeah, here we go again, 2024. So.
Yeah. So, Steve, could you tell the listeners that, because we've got listeners in different parts of the world, how you've ended up doing the work that you're doing and what that work in fact is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just a little bit of context. Most of my career, for anyone who thinks I'm particularly young looking, I'm a man in his early to mid 60s now, but most of my career was in senior management in the automotive industry, the latter part of the career working in consultancy and leadership and management development as a director of a leadership and management company. And then more recently ran my own social media consultancy for 11 and a half years. And in fact, that's exactly the work that I was doing on December the 4th of 2019. In fact, delivering, as I recall, a Facebook workshop for a group of senior leaders with International Motors in the Midlands. I got a call as I got in my car from my son Jordan's girlfriend, Charlotte. Not unusual necessarily to have got a call from her, but it wasn't. Text and WhatsApp probably were more the order of the day. So I had no reason to anticipate it was anything other than a social call from her. But in the moments from answering that call to Charlotte and hearing the distress as she apologised over and over again and told me that Jordan had killed himself. And that was my first entry that I can recollect really into the world of suicide. My son Jordan diagnosed with clinical anxiety and depression in 2015, some 4 years earlier, but not for one moment was there a consideration in my mind or anyone that really knew Jordan that suicide might be a consideration.
Yeah. And it's, as we were speaking before, there's a huge element, a huge impact it has across your family, your friends, and your work colleagues as well, doesn't it? And that's something that I've been watching from afar, the work that you do with the Jordan legacy, but and it does seem as though now businesses, are coming into this space and asking, well, what can we do? Am I being eternally optimistic here, Steve?
Look, I think it's important to be eternally optimistic, Peter, and be hopeful as well. I think I think it's interesting. I think there is, without question, generally more awareness around mental health, and to a degree suicide now, but certainly mental health. We're seeing this through celebrities in the media and on TV, and workplaces are becoming more aware. I think what we've seen a move towards introducing mental health first aiders. We've seen many companies introducing more awareness around mental health, less so with suicide. I think that's still a difficult subject for many of them to deal with. But I still think we have a long way to go. And the reason why I say that is that even the most well-meaning of companies are putting in place mental health first aiders or special mental health days, or maybe bringing in a speaker like myself to talk to their employees. But few are going that next step, which is about really embedding employee well-being into the culture of the organization from top down. And I think that's the fundamental change that we need to see, really.
Yeah. And one of the, I know we tracked, what a terrible statement, watched over the last few years. I mean, the Baton of Hope, how did you get involved in the Baton of Hope?
Well, that was an interesting journey because anyone listening, certainly in the UK, to your podcast here, Peter, will know the Baton of Hope toured the UK through June and July, 12 days, 12 cities throughout the UK. Without doubt, probably the biggest coming together of people who've been impacted by suicide that the UK has seen, ending up in Downing Street, and of course Rishi Sunak coming out of 10 Downing Street to talk about the Baton of Hope. It really was born out of a conversation, really, that Mike McCarthy, one of the co-founders, Ian McClure at that stage, Paul Vittles, who works at the Jordan Legacy with me, and myself had, following a conference that the Jordan Legacy held in December 2021, where we talked about what should we do next? What can we do to really make a difference in the UK? And I know Mike at that time, still very early days following Ross's suicide, his own son, was still very angry, understandably, really wanted to make a difference. And the conversation really started around a march on Downing Street. And I think as that conversation expanded, it turned into something really much more around hope, much more about raising awareness. And we were therefore instrumental in helping design some of that early strategy website content. Some months into the project, though, I think we recognized, both Paul and I, the impact that being involved with the Baton of Hope from an organizing point of view was having on ourselves, our own well-being and our mental health, and particularly trying to manage the Jordan Legacy at the same time. And we had to make a very difficult decision in the September of 22 to step back from involvement directly with the Baton of Hope, I think for our own well-being, and for the well-being of the Jordan Legacy, which of course was closest to my heart for obvious reasons. So we stepped back from afar. We got involved. Certainly I went down to Sheffield with my daughter Danielle to be involved with the Sheffield leg and be on stage with Mike at the end. And very generously, they continued to refer to us as the co-founders of the Baton of Hope. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome while all that was going on, I think, during the tour. But nevertheless, I think it was a huge success, certainly in terms of raising awareness about suicide.
Yeah, I mean, it was massive, and I don't know about you, but coming out of the lockdown and coming out, the pandemic, we did see an explosion of interest, didn't we, in mental health, and suddenly realised actually we were sociable animals, and we took that social element away. And that increase, some of the recent data from the World Health Organization says there's been a 25% increase in depression and anxiety, and 12% increase in suicide globally. And if you look back at the Spanish flu pandemic in 1917, you'll see post that pandemic, there was an increase in mental ill health as well, and suicide. So it was kind of predictable, but it doesn't come along for 110 years.
I think it's really interesting, Peter, that I think there was an immediate conclusion jump to that during the pandemic and lockdowns, suicides would increase. And in fact, there was a lot of propaganda on Twitter. I remember one famous tweet saying suicides have increased by 220% or something like that. Of course, we know now that if anything, there was a very short drop, a small drop in the number of suicides during that period. But if we think about it logically, what happened during that period of lockdown was that we all came together as a society and looked after our neighbours and checked in, which is a lesson for us, I think, in a way we hadn't done before. But now what we've got is we've got the legacy of COVID. We've got long COVID that people are suffering from. We've got the impact of the lack of schooling and education on young people and the challenges that brought. And there are a number of businesses that were unable to continue as a result of the pandemic. So I think we are seeing now this long tail of COVID in terms of mental health and by association, I suppose, the increased risk of suicides increasing in the annual statistics that we record.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly, the data that was coming from ONS through the lockdown period was there. And, the fact that people had people around people, if you're in a bubble, or you made your own bubble, but then coming out, this has been an explosion on well-being. And a lot of it's been about you, the individual, and not really the corporate responsibility. So, Can you tell our listeners what the founding foundations are for the Jordan Legacy? Those things that when you sat down and you went, I'm going to do this. This is what we want to represent. Because I know them, but I'd rather hear from the horse's mouth, as they say.
Yeah, you're very much suggesting that we had that level of plan in the beginning. I think in all honesty. In the weeks and months following Jordan's death and the trauma that I was experiencing personally and the family, I had a lot of questions. Clearly, I knew very little about mental health and suicide. Something I'm very conscious of, and why I think education is so important for families. So as I learned more and researched, read books, spoke to people, I knew I wanted to do something. Wasn't quite sure what that would be, what that would look like. And through conversations I had, and coming together really with Paul Bittles, who works closely with me, who'd had experience of working with the zero suicide community globally, and particularly his work in Australia, he kind of opened my eyes to kind of the steps leading up to suicides, the practical solutions that could be put in place. And I think it became fairly clear from those conversations that what we would do, and we actually coined a phrase internally between us, we never usually share publicly. We talked about the business of suicide prevention. And that's kind of what we moved into, was could we in some way impact in any way on the figures and the number of people that take their own lives, rather than look at it from a clinical point of view, or me learn to become a psychologist or anything like that, or a crisis helpline. That wasn't where we decided to go. So really the fundamental principles are to collaborate and work closely with governments, communities, workplaces, to look at what we can do to move these annual numbers on a downward trajectory, which they haven't done now for 15 years, despite successive national suicide prevention strategies from our government. They just haven't moved at all. And despite the rhetoric that we hear from certain ministers that progress is being made, they're obviously not looking at the same graphs that we are. So our work centers around those types of collaborations and partnerships, really, and very much the focus of our work in 2024 will see that step up a gear as well.
Okay, because I guess from you'll have seen that most of the work in this area has been reactive. It is after an incident has occurred, or it's an investigation of it's a number of things. Whereas I did some suicide prevention training very early on when I was at my HSC life. And it was, and back then that was 25 years ago. So we had knowledge about how to prevent, But it was that crossover from the community, from the medical into the community and into businesses. And what we have seen is that suicide and the age of people for suicide is now sort of moving across. So there was very much a traditional sort of age range, and that's changing, which means that people will be in work, and potentially they may die by suicide, and their colleagues then have to know, well, what do I do? So in your training with businesses, or your engagement with businesses, are they getting the message that we should be doing something before? You know what I mean? Because it's...
Yeah, it's interesting because many of the talks I'm invited to speak on, and there's a kind of a signature talk that I deliver, which is called "How to Cope with the S Word," and it's very much about almost a reactive situation of, if you spot someone who's struggling, firstly, how do you spot those signs? And if you do, how do you open up and have that conversation and support that individual? So that in itself is very interesting, that's the most popular talk that I'm asked to deliver, which is, we've seen something of concern, we need a strategy to deal with it. So again, a reactive response to evidence presented to us. With the considerably fewer, but nevertheless organisations we're working with, such as Northumbria Police, for example, or the law firm Shoesmiths, they're taking very different attitudes, where they are looking at introducing suicide prevention strategies and policies within the organisation, and postvention as well, should the event occur tragically. And it's those kind of organisations that are waking up and recognising that they need to have processes in place to mitigate the risk in the first instance, and prevent suicide in the truest sense. So I still think we have a long way to go from our experience. You've only got to look, from your experience in HSE, and look at RIDDOR reporting, for example, where suicide is specifically excluded from deaths within that HSC regulation. So, even HSC has some work to do to kind of look at that, I think. So I think we still have a long way to go before companies recognise that there is a risk of suicide. It's not going to affect everyone, but it can affect anyone. It can affect anyone of a working age, that 29, particularly through to 54, 55 age group, but even younger as well. So what are the things we need to be aware of? And I think one of the biggest things is probably better training for middle managers, in terms of how they communicate and engage with employees, and how they themselves become skilled enough to recognize the signs if someone's struggling, but also to look at, from an organizational point of view, so this now involves HR and senior management, at the policies and procedures that are in place within an organization, or those that are about to be introduced, and to look at them from what we would call a do no harm perspective, i.e., if we introduce this policy, is there a risk, or within an existing policy, is there a risk that this could have an adverse effect on the employee? And if that employee is not mentally robust or psychologically robust, is there a risk that we could create a further problem through the introduction of that policy? Now, these are things that companies are just not thinking of until I share at least one own story to me, and of a young man called Richard, who was brought in for a disciplinary conversation with HR. It was his vocation. He loved the job, but he was brought in. A conversation was had about a complaint that had risen against him. He was suspended from work with immediate effect, given a printed out copy of his employee assistance program, told to go home, not to speak to anyone on the way out of the workplace. He subsequently caught a train that night with the initial intentions, I believe, of visiting his parents, but stopped halfway on that journey, and that was the last day on this earth for Richard. And I know the story beyond that. I know the engagement the family have had with the company in question. I know the trauma the HR director experienced as a result of hearing the news the following day. And if you look at that one example and say, how could that procedure have been handled differently in terms of safeguarding that employee, rather than just looking at that employee as being the problem, and as a result, he needed to be suspended because of that problem. So, I think that's just one example of where policies and procedures and management approaches, are not thought through in terms of the impact it might have on someone who's not psychologically robust.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Sounds very much like the France Telecom, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes, very much so.
Where, significant change, etc., went on, and we know the executives, face prison terms from that. But yeah, prevention side of things is massively important, and policies and procedures. If you're going to do a change program, be aware that the change program might not make everyone happy, and you need to manage that. And disastrous change programs are a really good indicator of where your next level of work-related stress depression and anxiety will come from. And I've been to organisations and said, well, you've got 3 change programs coming on here, and if one of them doesn't go right, you're going to have a problem. And 6 months later, they did. And it was like,
I think this is really interesting, Peter, because if I just take myself back to my days in management and leadership training as a director of a training company and going into large multinational organizations to train leaders and managers, we would coach workshops on change management, and we would talk about how change can affect employees and the processes that should be in place to deal with that. And this isn't that long ago. We're talking kind of early 2000s, probably here to mid 2000s. There was no talk then about the potential mental health issues that might be created as a result. We weren't even teaching that back then. So, this is still very new to a lot of companies.
It's interesting. There's a theory of change by Prochaska, a couple of academics from America. They talk about pre-contemplation and contemplation. And management is the contemplation. They know why they want to have change. Most of the employees are at pre-contemplation. They have no idea why the change is coming about. And so if you take that into that context, if you're blindsided as a leader to what might be the impact below, then the potential is there. And like I was thinking about my role in Mates of Mine as their mental health advisor. Sometimes we've had calls, and we've had to go and we've gone out on site and we've supported the teams that have been there when a suicide has occurred in work. So it's still a relatively rare occurrence, but it does occur. And but even if it doesn't occur in work and it still occurs, it's the same, isn't it? Is it not?
Oh, very, very, very much so. We were talking beforehand, aren't we? That we know the numbers, we know the statistics. We lose more than 6,000 plus people to suicide in the UK every year. The construction industry, you refer to Mates in Mind. We know that approximately 10% of all suicides happen within that industry, to a mainly male workforce.
720.
720 is the actual number. Yeah. So. Yeah. So we know what the numbers are, but we also, we're well aware through the work that we do that for every suicide that happens, that another 20 people will attempt. And then we also know that suicide is potentially massively underreported as well, and not always is the verdict a suicide where the family believe it is. And so, I think it's really important to stress that statistically, the chances of you being impacted by suicide are rare, but it is nevertheless an issue and a subject that should be of concern to everybody. And the positive news is that everybody can contribute to help preventing suicides. And I think that's the really important message.
It's a ripple, though, isn't it? It's that rippling effect of, like I said to Steve, a mate of mine that died by suicide, and I remember I said, well, I had all the skills. I'm a psychologist. I've done all this, but in that instant, but equally, I walked through the park one day, and there was a gentleman who was on the bridge. He was about to jump. There was a lady talking to him. I just got rid of everyone, and I said, just talk to him about things. Don't ask him why. Just talk to him about things. And the police were there, and I waited around, and we eventually got him to sit, and then sat down on the bridge, and they talked to him. And I just stood away from it, but it was calming it down, because there was so many points where you could intervene, and you can do that. And and I think it's a privilege enough when that occurs, and you want to just make sure people have got the right information, and that's what you're doing. You're giving the right information.
Yeah, I think something you said is really important. I think there's a fear from a lot of people that they need to have some kind of ology of some kind to be able to prevent suicide, and most people, if they're concerned that someone might be suicidal, might think, well, I can't fix this problem. I don't know what to do. And it's not about fixing the problem. It really is about just talking sometimes, and creating that distraction for long enough until help can arrive. And you could talk utter nonsense potentially and still save a life. I do that regularly, by the way, Peter. But yeah,
so do I. So people tell me. I mean, we have wonderful services such as Samaritans, and the various helplines. The construction sectors have helplines as well. Where you can. We shout, where you can text if you're a young person, because you don't want to necessarily talk. You want to text, so we can. So there are all these things, and I think it's being positive that we can get in there and do the prevention, and we can start that process. But Steve, you're doing something at the moment, aren't you? Which is that. Is fascinating to watch, and I would hope you can tell the listeners what it is that you're involved at the moment, and then how they can help.
Yes, well, hopefully we're talking on the same topic and lines here, Peter. But yes, I'll try and give the shortened version of this. But in 2023, the Jordan Legacy, we launched our Zero Suicide Society action research project, and that was to go out and speak to dozens and dozens of people that have been impacted professionally or personally by suicide. We asked many questions, but two fundamental ones. That was, do you believe we can significantly reduce the numbers of suicide from 6,000 plus in the UK? And to back up that question, if the answer was yes, well, how far do you think we can go? We published a report from those many conversations and wider conversations we'd had through our panel discussion events and radio show, etc. We published our report moving towards the Zero Suicide Society on July the 11th last year, Jordan's 38th birthday, and updated that report in September. And that's formed the basis of a strategy and a roadmap that hasn't been designed by us. We simply put it all together from the conversations we had, that says this is what needs to happen if we are to significantly reduce the numbers. It's there, it's a roadmap. And alongside that, we launched a petition to government, which is part of the jigsaw of this report. If we look at all the factions that can have an impact on suicide prevention within the community, within workplaces, within society, including education, the government is part of that jigsaw. So we launched a petition to government asking them to introduce a Suicide Prevention Act. That would be a centralised National Suicide Prevention Office with regional offices and partnerships as well, and a number of very specific areas within that petition to support the likes of the three dads who've been campaigning for education of suicide on the school curriculum. We mentioned RIDDOR reporting and the importance of suicide being included in that. So there are a number of very specific areas. It was a goal that we had, that if we could reach 100,000 signatures, we might get our day in Parliament to be able to have the parliamentary committee meeting and that discussion with ministers there. At the very least, if we could reach 10,000 signatures, that means that the government would need to respond formally to everyone who signed the signature. And I'm delighted to say that literally only a few weeks ago, we passed the 10,000 threshold, and we're eagerly anticipating a response from government. Did it capture the imagination in the same way as the three dads did, or the Learn Network, for example, who were petitioning for a statutory duty of care in universities? Not in the same way, and I think it's because our petition was much broader. It didn't just focus on one emotive subject like young people, for example, in schools. It incorporated a number of things, but I think what it has done is it's put the whole idea of government taking a very different approach and taking a responsibility for suicide in the conscience of many thousands of people during the last few months that we've had the petition going.
And is your intention to keep the petition open to get to 100,000?
Our intention would be, absolutely, Peter. Unfortunately, we're dictated to by the government, who will shut the window on that on January the 19th. So that will, wherever we've got to at that point, will be it. What we are doing, though, is, and really a very big event and undertaking for the Jordan Legacy this year, is that we're going to take our Moving Towards a Zero Suicide report, which is now becoming our Zero Suicide Society transformational program, and we are literally now taking this out on the road. And we haven't made the formal announcement yet, so you're probably one of the first to hear this. But this will involve a tour from the Humber across to Merseyside in June. Its arrival in Liverpool will coincide with the Zero Suicide Global Summit, with all the movers and shakers from Detroit and Australia and everybody coming together in Liverpool, where we'll be part of that event. But the idea of the tour along that almost M62 corridor, if you like, will be to pull everyone together who is working in suicide prevention or is interested in being involved in suicide prevention, to demonstrate the model, the transformational model, how it can work. There'll be talks, different to the Baton of Hope, which was very much about raising awareness. What we're looking at here is, what are the practical actions that are taking place right now, and how can all those be pulled together to see a greater collaboration, which is really going to affect the change that we need in this country. Because I think for too long, all those great people, wonderful people working in suicide prevention have done so almost in isolation. And it is time for us to really come together. So, yeah, there's a bit of news hot off the press for you there.
As I'm based in Preston, I can join you on the M62 march. I assume you go down the A59.
Yes, I was going to say, I've been roped into, being a keen cyclist, I've been roped into the fact where we're going to be doing a big fundraiser cycle as part of this event. I noticed Paul hasn't got his bike out for this one, but so we will be calling in all cyclists, anyone with two wheels that's keen to join us on the route. But there'll be much more news coming out.
Electronic bikes accepted?
Absolutely. I think anybody that can stay upright on any kind of two-wheel or three-wheel vehicle is more than welcome. So,
yeah, no, I know. And what was the date? Can you tell the listeners?
Yeah, the tour is actually going to start off in Scunthorpe. We've booked a conference to take place there at the Bath Hall in Scunthorpe, and that's mainly down to the work being done by everyone in suicide prevention in the Lincoln and area there. And so June the 12th is the date for that conference. And then we have various events, including York Ending Stigma, that'll be showing their amazing film Why that they produced. That'll take place the following day. And then we're going to have a series of events taking place along that M62 corridor until we arrive in Liverpool. So we're really interested to hear from people who'd be keen to get involved and put on events and workshops. And we've had choirs get in touch, and all sorts of people like Adele Owen in Manchester wanted to get involved, and she was very much instrumental in the Baton of Hope as well. So we're already generating a lot of interest for this.
That's awesome. Do you know what is interesting, isn't it, Steve? The amount of films that have come out recently. Yeah, I mean, Tarmac have done one, mental health and suicide prevention. There's a number of different ones, and some really good educational material out. Simple things that you can put on social media, going back to your social media life, and get out there. But I'm sure it's about getting the right messages, isn't it?
It is. I think one of the biggest messages, most powerful and very short, simple messages, was the one put out by Norwich City Football Club. And in fact, by the time this show goes out, maybe I've already had the meeting, but I am meeting with Norwich City and the team that put that together, and in a week's time, and they are very keen as a football club to become real ambassadors for mental health in the Football League. You know, again, an organisation that's recognised that they can contribute and give back, if you like, to their fan base. So it was
an amazing film. I've got it on my LinkedIn, but and other places. But it's, two gentlemen. One doesn't seem very happy. The other one's really engaged and very excited about the football over a course of about 8 weeks. And then at the end of it, it's the one who was excited who isn't there.
And I think what's really interesting, Peter, and I learned this from the conversation with Norwich, is that the two gentlemen in question were just budding sort of amateur actors locally in Norwich, and the rest of the crowd you see behind are the marketing team that put it together. They just roped everyone in. So you don't need any great budget from MGM Studios or anyone to do this sometimes. So.
So what we normally do towards the end of this is leave our listeners with one last grand thought, or something that you maybe want to tell your younger self, or in this area. Honestly, Steve, you're doing amazing work, and I know people tell you this, but I'd always have your back, because I think what you're doing is raising something that, you can't be in this field and not feel. You know what I mean? And I think I just wanted,
it's really important. No, thank you, Peter. Really appreciate that. And I think, the message is really clear, and it is, very relatable to my circumstance and situation, talking to myself of 4 years ago. And it is about education. I go back to the fact that suicide will not affect everyone, but it can affect anyone. And just as we're taught first aid, physical first aid, and the importance of maybe learning the Heimlich maneuver or something like that, I think, if we can learn as a society, as parents, as loved ones, to understand a bit more about mental health, and particularly suicide, I think, and if you are concerned, what do you do about that? And I think one of the best pieces of information that's out there, and simple training that's free to access, is the training from the Zero Suicide Alliance. Go on the Zero Suicide Alliance website. There's a 20-minute training course online that will just equip you with those essential tools that you need. Is completely free to access. It's supported and certified. I don't know if certified is the right word, but accredited by the NHS as well, or NHS approved is maybe.
Right. It's NHS approved.
Yes, that was the term I was clutching for there. So we know it's a good source of training material.
Well, we can put that at the end of the
we can all find 20 minutes in our day, in our lunch break, to go and watch that.
Yeah, no, that's been brilliant. Well, thank you so much for this. What we're going to do now is just tell the listeners here that there will be links available in the various elements of places where you can go, ones that Steve mentioned, amongst others. Thank you, Steve, for making the message simple. And it is that we can do things, and we can make a difference in this space. So for those of our listeners, please enjoy it on the various different podcast options that you have on YouTube, on Apple or Android. And thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.